At precisely 10:15 in the morning on August 17, 1943, General Adolf Galland, a towering figure in the Luftwaffe's fighter command, stood on the platform at Rintenheath in East Prussia. The station was alive with the clatter of wheels, steam, and the soft hum of conversation among officers and railway personnel. Galland's eyes followed the figure of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring as he ascended the steps onto his opulently decorated train. The luxurious carriages gleamed in the morning sun, a testament to the power and prestige Göring wielded over the Luftwaffe and the German war machine. Earlier that day, the two men had met in a tense conference discussing Luftwaffe fighter operations, with Galland armed with intelligence of utmost urgency, intelligence that could not be delayed another minute. The core of his warning was simple yet dire. American fighter aircraft were now appearing deep within German airspace, a development that threatened to overturn the Luftwaffe's tactical assumptions and jeopardize the very air defense of the Reich. Earlier that morning, Luftwaffe units had intercepted an enormous American bomber raid targeting Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The mission, vast in scope and heavily escorted, followed patterns that German commanders had come to expect over the previous months. Fighter squadrons waited at the frontier, poised to engage the attackers once they crossed into German airspace. American escort fighters, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, would usually turn back after consuming their fuel, leaving the bombers vulnerable as they pressed forward into the Reich. German pilots had developed strategies around these predictable limits, striking when the bombers were unprotected. Yet, on this August day, the predictable sequence was broken. Reports flooded in from Luftwaffe squadrons that, after the expected Thunderbolts had withdrawn, another wave of American fighters appeared, this time of a different type entirely. These were not damaged P-47s gliding home from previous engagements. These were Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, and they carried external drop tanks that extended their range far beyond what the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. The implications were immediate and alarming. The American escort fighters could now accompany bombers deep into the heart of Germany, rendering traditional Luftwaffe tactics obsolete. Galland had spent hours consolidating reports from squadron commanders across the Reich, piecing together a complete picture of the unprecedented threat. He approached Göring on the platform, carefully selecting his words, aware that every second mattered. He presented the findings. Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, equipped with drop tanks, had engaged German fighters over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and targets well beyond the reach of any escort that the Luftwaffe had previously considered a limit. The previous doctrine of waiting until enemy escorts turned back was now meaningless. Göring, however, received the intelligence with disbelief. His expression hardened, and his voice rose in a mixture of indignation and denial. He rejected Galland's evidence, insisting that American fighters could not possibly penetrate so deeply into German territory. According to the Reichsmarschall, the reports must be based on flukes, damaged aircraft drifting east after being hit over France or Belgium, anomalies that could not represent a real operational capability. Galland attempted to clarify, detailing the drop tank system, explaining how multiple squadrons had independently observed the same phenomenon, and insisting that these were fully operational, combat-ready aircraft. Yet Göring was resolute. He issued a direct order denying the threat. The Reich's leadership had already made its decision. The intelligence contradicting their assumptions would be ignored. Galland, with what witnesses later described as a memorable and wry smile, acknowledged the order. The train departed, leaving Galland with a chilling understanding. The Luftwaffe had just been denied the opportunity to prepare for an enemy capability that would soon decimate it. The consequences began almost immediately. On the very day of the confrontation, during the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids, the Luftwaffe suffered the loss of approximately 25 to 27 fighters, many felled by long-range P-38s that Göring had claimed could not exist. The twin missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg confirmed exactly what Galland had warned. American bombers could penetrate deep into Germany with fighter escorts accompanying them throughout the mission. German pilots engaging these bombers found themselves intercepted by P-38s that appeared from altitudes and distances previously considered unreachable. The battle was fierce and chaotic. German fighters achieved some success, shooting down American bombers, but the cost was tremendous. For the first time, Luftwaffe commanders faced the stark reality that the assumption of predictable escort limits was no longer valid. Tactics developed around the idea of engagement after escort withdrawal were rendered useless. The Luftwaffe now had to assume that American fighters could appear anywhere, at any moment, regardless of distance from the border. Weeks later, on September 6, 1943, Galland's warnings were confirmed once more during a mission targeting Stuttgart. American B-17 bombers were escorted by P-38s deep into southern Germany. Major Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished bomber destroyers with 57 confirmed kills, led the interception. Mayer had pioneered head-on attacks against American bombers, exploiting the frontal approach to minimize exposure to defensive fire. During this engagement, Mayer's squadron executed their usual tactics, scoring hits on several bombers. But then the P-38 escorts revealed their position from above and behind the formation. Mayer's unit scattered under the sudden attack. 3 German fighters were shot down in the initial pass. Mayer himself narrowly escaped when a P-38 locked onto his tail. He performed a steep dive maneuver, outrunning the heavier American fighter, yet 5 of his pilots failed to return. The mission ended in catastrophe. 0 bombers were destroyed, and the squadron suffered irreplaceable losses. The pattern was unmistakable. American escorts had now reached depths within Germany that the Luftwaffe had never previously accounted for, and the old assumptions of tactical engagement had been shattered. By October 1943, the consequences of ignoring Galland's intelligence became increasingly clear. American bombers, continuously escorted by long-range fighters, conducted deep penetration raids across Germany. The Luftwaffe continued to rely on tactics predicated on assumptions that were demonstrably false, resulting in repeated, catastrophic losses. On October 14, Black Thursday, another raid on Schweinfurt led to disastrous outcomes for both sides. 60 American bombers were destroyed, yet the Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters and 42 pilots, with many more wounded. The exchange ratio, previously in favor of German fighters at 3 or 4 bombers per fighter, had now fallen to near parity, signaling a destructive trajectory. The losses of experienced aces, including Headman Wilhelm Lemke of Jagdgeschwader III, who had 131 confirmed kills and was killed in combat on December 4, 1943, exacerbated the Luftwaffe's strategic vulnerability. Such experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Their deaths diminished both combat effectiveness and the capacity to train replacements. Galland's analyses were meticulous. By November 1943, he compiled reports showing an accelerating trend of losses: 87 fighters lost in June, 106 in July, 174 in August, 193 in September, and 224 in October. Equally alarming, the ratio of experienced pilots to novices had inverted. In June, 60% of pilots had over 6 months of combat experience. By October, only 40% did. Galland warned that, without immediate action, the Luftwaffe would reach a critical breaking point within 6 months, where losses would surpass the training pipeline's capacity to replenish pilots. He submitted the report to Göring, the Air Ministry, and all available command channels. Silence was the response. The Reichsmarschall refused to acknowledge the crisis, issuing directives focused on morale and aggressive tactics without addressing the underlying problem. German pilots were increasingly outnumbered, outtrained, and outperformed by Allied fighters operating with superior range and capability. The Luftwaffe's predicament worsened in early 1944. By January, Intelligence reports indicated that American bombers were coordinating raids with unprecedented precision, combining multiple bomber streams with long-range fighter cover that extended to nearly every major industrial center in Germany. Cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, and Leipzig, previously considered relatively secure, now faced near-daily aerial threats. The Luftwaffe attempted to adapt by reorganizing fighter wings into flexible defensive sectors, creating overlapping patrol zones designed to intercept bombers before they reached key targets. However, coordination proved extremely difficult. German radar coverage was limited, and with the introduction of new American fighter models, particularly the P-51 Mustang, the Luftwaffe found itself struggling to match both the range and performance of its adversaries. The P-51 Mustang was a game-changer. Powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it combined exceptional speed, maneuverability, and endurance. For the Luftwaffe, the implications were immediate and dire. Unlike the P-38 or P-47, which had specific operational limitations, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to targets deep within Germany and return to England without refueling. German pilots, already stretched thin and operating under immense pressure, now faced an enemy that could fight them on equal terms across the entire battlefield. Reports from frontline units described encounters in which Luftwaffe aces, some of whom had survived hundreds of missions, were forced into desperate defensive maneuvers against Mustangs that seemed to appear from nowhere. In February 1944, during a raid on Berlin involving more than 900 bombers, Jagdgeschwader 26 was dispatched to intercept the approaching force. Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, known for his daring attack runs and precise gunnery, led the operation. His squadron spotted the formation over Brandenburg, moving at high altitude, heavily defended by P-51s. Priller personally engaged a B-17 bomber, scoring hits on its fuselage, but the Mustang escorts quickly intervened. Within minutes, 3 of Priller's aircraft were downed, including his wingman. The survivors were forced to break off, regroup, and retreat toward friendly territory. After-action reports revealed the scale of the losses: 14 fighters destroyed, 10 pilots killed, 3 missing. The American bombers continued toward Berlin largely unscathed. Galland's earlier warnings had been realized. The Luftwaffe could no longer rely on old doctrines or predictable limitations of enemy escorts. The impact of these raids went beyond pilot casualties. Factories, transportation hubs, and oil refineries were systematically targeted, crippling Germany's war production. Despite heroic efforts by the Luftwaffe, aircraft production lagged behind the attrition rate. In the first quarter of 1944 alone, Germany lost 450 fighter aircraft in combat missions, while producing only 320 to 350 replacements. Experienced pilots, once the backbone of German air defense, were lost faster than they could be trained and deployed. Training programs were accelerated, reducing flight hours and combat instruction to a fraction of the previous standard. Young pilots were sent directly into combat with minimal experience, often against seasoned American crews operating the latest aircraft. The imbalance was growing catastrophic. By March 1944, Galland had taken extraordinary measures. He organized elite interception units, composed of veteran pilots and highly skilled instructors, aiming to maximize combat effectiveness despite dwindling numbers. These units, often called Expertenzstaffeln, were deployed to areas under imminent threat, where American bomber formations were most likely to penetrate. Galland also advocated for the development of specialized aircraft optimized for high-altitude interception, such as the Focke-Wulf Ta-152, designed to operate above 12,000 meters, where Allied bombers and escorts could not easily follow. However, production delays and fuel shortages hindered implementation, leaving most Luftwaffe units reliant on older aircraft like the Bf-109G and FW-190A, which, while formidable, were increasingly outmatched by long-range Allied fighters. The human cost of this imbalance was immense. Pilots were constantly exhausted, flying multiple sorties per day with little rest. A typical day in early 1944 might involve a morning interception, a brief refueling, and an afternoon patrol over Berlin or Hamburg. Night raids added additional stress and disorientation. Galland personally noted the deterioration of pilot morale and cohesion. Letters and reports from frontline units described fear, fatigue, and frustration. Experienced aces lamented the loss of their comrades and the impossibility of teaching new pilots the intricate tactics required for survival in the modern air war. The attrition rate was staggering. By mid-1944, roughly 1 in 3 Luftwaffe pilots in operational units had been killed, wounded, or captured since the beginning of 1943. The P-51 Mustang and the strategic bombing campaign forced a critical reassessment of Luftwaffe strategy. Galland repeatedly pressed for changes in command doctrine, flexible engagement patterns, earlier interception, concentrated fighter groups, and revised training programs emphasizing high-altitude combat. He also recognized the need for technological solutions, including improved radar integration and jet aircraft like the Me-262. Yet bureaucratic inertia and Göring's stubborn adherence to outdated thinking stymied these efforts. High command consistently favored aggressive morale speeches and public declarations of air superiority, rather than practical measures addressing the operational crisis. The result was repeated operational failure, escalating losses, and increasing vulnerability of Germany's industrial base. In April 1944, a series of missions targeting the Ruhr Valley revealed the Luftwaffe's growing desperation. Over 1,200 bombers, escorted by hundreds of P-51s and P-38s, approached key industrial targets. Interception units were scrambled at dawn. Galland personally oversaw the allocation of limited forces. The Luftwaffe achieved some tactical successes, a dozen bombers destroyed, several P-51s downed. However, these victories came at a high cost. 48 German fighters were lost, including some of the most experienced pilots still in service. The following week, reports indicated that American bomber production had suffered minimal disruption, while German fighter losses continued unabated. The broader implications were strategic. Allied air superiority allowed for continuous bombing of German infrastructure, paving the way for the Normandy invasion in June 1944. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest the airspace effectively contributed directly to the success of Operation Overlord, as Allied forces were able to move troops, supplies, and equipment with relative impunity. Galland foresaw the consequences of this unchecked air dominance, noting in secret communications the existential threat to Germany's capacity to wage total war. Galland also recognized a personal responsibility to his pilots. He increasingly focused on leadership initiatives, training elite units capable of defensive excellence despite numerical inferiority. He encouraged innovative tactics, including head-on attacks against bomber formations, high-speed dives to break escort formations, and concentrated group maneuvers to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure. These innovations had limited tactical success, but the overwhelming superiority in numbers and technology of the Allies meant that even exceptional skill could only mitigate losses, not prevent them. By May 1944, Galland had compiled one of the most comprehensive analyses of Luftwaffe operational decline. His reports highlighted the integration of long-range American fighters, the inadequacy of German high-altitude aircraft, the critical shortage of experienced pilots, and the unsustainable attrition rate of frontline units. Recommendations included accelerated production of advanced aircraft, revised pilot training emphasizing high-altitude interception, reorganization of defensive sectors, and immediate adoption of jet aircraft to regain air superiority. However, these recommendations were largely ignored by Goering and the High Command, who remained confident in traditional fighter doctrines and overestimated the Luftwaffe's remaining capabilities. The summer of 1944 brought a new level of urgency and chaos to the Luftwaffe. Following the D-Day landings on June 6, Allied forces established a beachhead in Normandy, and Germany's Western Front became a desperate theater of war. The Luftwaffe was tasked with repelling the invasion, but its already diminished resources were stretched to the breaking point. Oberst Adolf Galland, now acutely aware of both the limitations of his command and the overwhelming technological advantage of the Allies, focused on extracting maximum effectiveness from his remaining pilots. Yet the reality was grim. The Luftwaffe no longer had the numbers or equipment to contest Allied air superiority meaningfully. By June 10, 1944, Allied air forces had established near-total control over the skies above Normandy. Long-range P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings provided continuous cover for ground forces and logistical movements, while B-17 and B-24 bombers systematically targeted bridges, rail lines, and German troop concentrations. Galland's fighter units attempted desperate interceptions, often engaging in short, high-risk sorties with minimal support. Pilots reported encountering massive bomber formations with fighter escorts so numerous and coordinated that engaging them almost guaranteed losses. The Luftwaffe attempted innovative tactics, such as wild-assault night interception missions using single-seat fighters guided by flares and searchlights, but these were only marginally effective against massed Allied air operations. One particularly harrowing engagement occurred on June 15, near the Caen sector. Galland coordinated a sortie involving 3 Gruppen of Bf-109s, intending to disrupt Allied bombing of supply depots. As the fighters ascended, they encountered a formation of over 200 bombers escorted by more than 100 Mustangs. The ensuing battle was chaotic. German pilots executed head-on attacks, dove from extreme altitudes, and used cloud cover for evasion. Despite acts of extraordinary bravery, the Luftwaffe suffered catastrophic losses. Out of 36 fighters dispatched, 22 were destroyed, and multiple pilots were killed or captured. The mission's limited success did little to slow Allied advances. Bombers inflicted heavy damage on bridges and depots critical for German troop movements. Reports afterward reflected the increasing desperation and futility of traditional Luftwaffe tactics against overwhelming Allied numbers. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. By mid-1944, Germany's synthetic oil production had been heavily targeted, leaving frontline units with minimal reserves. Pilots were often forced to take off with just enough fuel for one sortie, making extended engagements or multiple interceptions impossible. Mechanical failures incur. Eased as maintenance crews, stretched thin, struggled to service aircraft under relentless operational pressure. Galland noted that the combination of attrition, fuel scarcity, and outdated equipment was eroding both morale and combat effectiveness. Young pilots, sent into battle with only weeks of experience, faced the dual challenges of technological inferiority and overwhelming opposition. At the same time, the Allies refined their tactics. Bomber formations adjusted flight paths to avoid known Luftwaffe sectors, while fighter escorts executed complex maneuvers to protect vulnerable bombers from head-on or high-speed attacks. P-51 Mustangs operated in tight groups, coordinated through advanced radio communications, allowing them to respond to Luftwaffe incursions almost instantaneously. Pilots reported feeling as though the airspace was entirely controlled by the enemy. German pilots likened it to entering a kill zone with almost no margin for error. These encounters underscored the transformation of air warfare. Speed, coordination, and technology had decisively surpassed the experience and audacity that once defined Luftwaffe supremacy. Galland's response was multifaceted. Recognizing that conventional strategies were failing, he began experimenting with smaller, highly mobile units capable of rapid interception and withdrawal. He emphasized the use of experienced aces as squadron leaders, ensuring that at least some engagements could be conducted with tactical precision. He also advocated for the increased deployment of jet aircraft like the Me-262, capable of outrunning any Allied piston-engine fighter. Yet production delays and competing priorities, particularly Hitler's insistence on using jets as strategic bombers rather than defensive fighters, limited the practical impact of these innovations. Meanwhile, the human toll continued to rise. Families of Luftwaffe pilots were frequently unaware of the dangers their loved ones faced daily. Letters described exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of death. Veterans of earlier campaigns often expressed frustration at the inexperience of new recruits, many of whom lacked the situational awareness and decision-making skills required in high-speed aerial combat. Galland took personal responsibility for these pilots, attempting to mentor and protect them as much as possible. Yet the structural deficiencies of the Luftwaffe and the relentless pace of Allied operations left little room for effective intervention. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 further demonstrated the Luftwaffe's declining effectiveness. As German ground forces attempted to retreat from encirclement, Allied air superiority allowed for near-continuous harassment from both fighters and bombers. German convoys were decimated, supply lines destroyed, and retreating units forced into chaotic maneuvers under constant aerial attack. Galland coordinated sorties intended to protect fleeing columns, but the losses were staggering. Reports indicated that Luftwaffe aircraft attempting to engage the Allies often failed to inflict meaningful damage before being shot down. Even the most experienced pilots could not overcome the overwhelming numerical and technological advantage of the enemy. On a strategic level, the fall of Paris in late August 1944 marked a symbolic and operational turning point. The Luftwaffe's inability to impede Allied advances underscored a growing reality. Germany's air defense was no longer sufficient to protect key territories. Galland, acutely aware of the implications, shifted focus toward preserving remaining forces, reorganizing units into defensive pockets, and attempting to buy time for rearmament and deployment of advanced aircraft. Yet logistical constraints, including destroyed rail networks and fuel shortages, severely limited mobility and operational reach. Into September, Allied bombing campaigns intensified, targeting Berlin, Munich, and other industrial hubs with precision previously unimaginable. Galland's units were increasingly relegated to defensive operations, often intercepting smaller bomber groups in an attempt to conserve fuel and aircraft. Even with tactical ingenuity, losses continued to outpace replacements. The Luftwaffe's strategic options had narrowed dramatically. Without sufficient experienced pilots, modern aircraft, and logistical support, it could no longer challenge Allied air superiority in any meaningful way. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Pilots reported heightened anxiety, increased risk-taking, and declining morale. Letters sent home often described a sense of inevitability, the feeling that each mission could be their last. Galland himself struggled with this reality, balancing his duty to defend the Reich with his responsibility to protect his men. He increasingly became a vocal critic of high command decisions, advocating for practical reforms and realistic deployment strategies rather than symbolic gestures or public displays of confidence. By October 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Aircraft losses had reached unsustainable levels, with entire squadrons decimated in single engagements. Jet fighters like the Me-262, though revolutionary, were too few to change the outcome. Experienced pilots were nearly exhausted, new recruits were insufficiently trained, and fuel shortages limited operational capabilities. Galland's repeated pleas for strategic reorganization, technological prioritization, and realistic training went largely unheeded. Despite these challenges, Galland continued to push the boundaries of tactical innovation. He encouraged new interception techniques, integrated radar guidance wherever possible, and emphasized teamwork and communication among remaining units. Small-scale successes occurred, but they were tactical rather than strategic. Reports of downed Allied aircraft were celebrated within the Luftwaffe, but each success highlighted the asymmetry of the conflict. The Allies replaced losses almost instantly, while German replacements were increasingly scarce and inexperienced. By November 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation had deteriorated into near collapse. The Allies' relentless advance from both east and west meant that German airfields were increasingly vulnerable to attack. Fuel shortages had become critical. Many aircraft sat idle, grounded by a lack of resources. Maintenance crews were overworked, often operating in freezing conditions, and the rapid pace of attrition left them unable to repair damaged aircraft adequately. Morale among the remaining pilots was at an all-time low, and the psychological strain of facing an enemy with overwhelming numerical and technological superiority began to take its toll. Galland, though increasingly disillusioned, refused to abandon his post. He continued to lead sorties personally, coordinating what remained of the Luftwaffe's fighter wings in desperate attempts to defend critical targets. His strategy now emphasized precision over quantity. Small, highly skilled units conducted rapid interceptions against bombers or fighter sweeps, exploiting any opportunity for tactical advantage. Despite these efforts, the reality was grim. Each engagement carried a high risk of loss, and even victories were fleeting. Pilots who survived missions were physically and emotionally exhausted, many questioning the purpose of continued resistance. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 offered a brief glimmer of hope for German forces. As ground troops launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes, Luftwaffe units were called upon to provide close air support. Though poorly coordinated and limited by fuel shortages, these sorties managed to slow Allied advances in localized areas. Galland viewed this as proof that, even in reduced numbers, effective strategy and skilled pilots could influence battlefield outcomes. However, these successes were temporary, and the sheer scale of Allied air power ensured that German gains could not be sustained. Throughout this period, technological innovation remained both a promise and a source of frustration. Jet aircraft like the Me-262 had the potential to change the balance of power, but Hitler's insistence on using them as bombers delayed their deployment as fighters. Ground-based anti-aircraft defenses, while increasingly sophisticated, could not compensate for the lack of operational aircraft. Galland continued to push for the concentration of jets in defensive roles, understanding that only speed, firepower, and tactical precision could offset Allied numerical superiority. Yet these recommendations were frequently ignored or delayed by bureaucratic inertia, leaving German forces vulnerable and increasingly desperate. As winter deepened, supply lines crumbled under the relentless bombing campaigns. Railways, bridges, and fuel depots had been targeted systematically, leaving Luftwaffe units scattered and isolated. Pilots often flew missions with incomplete intelligence, inadequate fuel, and poorly maintained aircraft. Each sortie became a gamble, with survival dependent on both skill and fortune. Galland's leadership was critical in these moments, as he attempted to coordinate efforts, provide guidance, and maintain cohesion among units teetering on the edge of collapse. The human cost was staggering. Veteran pilots were killed, wounded, or captured at an alarming rate, and replacements were young men with minimal training thrust into impossible situations. The psychological strain was compounded by the visible destruction of German cities and infrastructure. Letters from home reflected despair and hopelessness, mirroring the growing sense among pilots that the war was increasingly unwinnable. Galland himself struggled with the tension between duty and pragmatism, recognizing that heroic efforts could no longer alter the strategic trajectory of the conflict. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had become a shadow of its former might. Allied forces controlled the skies across nearly all of Germany, leaving German ground units exposed to unrelenting air attacks. Galland attempted one last series of defensive operations, concentrating his remaining aircraft in critical sectors and coordinating with ground forces for maximum effect. Small victories were achieved, downing Allied bombers or fighter aircraft in isolated encounters, but these successes were strategically insignificant. Each mission further depleted already scarce resources, highlighting the futility of continued resistance. The final months of the war saw the Luftwaffe's ultimate dissolution. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground or in combat, pilots were killed or captured, and remaining units fragmented under the pressure of overwhelming Allied forces. Galland, now a symbol of resilience and tactical brilliance, oversaw the withdrawal and surrender of what remained of his command. His focus shifted to preserving the lives of his men and documenting the lessons learned from years of relentless combat. In these closing days, the human element, courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice, stood in stark contrast to the strategic collapse of the Luftwaffe as an institution. In retrospect, the story of the Luftwaffe during 1944–1945 is one of extraordinary bravery under impossible circumstances. Galland and his pilots faced an adversary with overwhelming numerical superiority, technological advantage, and logistical strength. Yet they continued to fight, innovating tactically, mentoring new pilots, and striving for operational effectiveness despite systemic failures and shortages. The legacy of these men is complex. While ultimately unable to alter the outcome of the war, their actions reflect a remarkable combination of skill, dedication, and resilience in the face of near-certain defeat. By May 1945, as Germany surrendered, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an operational force. Its remaining pilots returned home, carrying with them the memories of intense aerial battles, the loss of comrades, and the knowledge of having faced one of the most formidable air campaigns in history. Galland's leadership during this period remained emblematic of the Luftwaffe's final chapter, a story of tactical ingenuity, human endurance, and the stark realities of total war. The skies that had once been dominated by German fighters were now firmly under Allied control, marking the end of an era and the conclusion of a struggle that had tested the limits of both man and machine.